Hi guys, this is Jim with Performance Technologies, back with the third part of our 300ZX twin turbo teardown. This time we'll be taking off the oil pan and getting the crank and rods out of the car. My space has been invaded by a 3000 GT that we had come in for some modifications. So I've been moved back to the rear portion of the shop. My normal teardown area is occupied currently. So we're going to get this thing flipped upside down. We'll do that slowly so that the water and oil that is remaining in the block can drain. I have a drain pan underneath it on the base of the engine stand. Just take your time, tilt it a little bit at a time, get everything drained out of it. Do be sure to have a drain pan underneath. Now we're going to lock it back in place and get the oil pan off of this thing. Let's start by taking off some of these brackets. That's the power steering bracket. Just 3 bolts, simple stuff. And this is a brace that bolts to the engine block and then bolts to a piece that runs across to the bell housing to kind of brace the bell housing and lower block assembly. I'm going to take out the oil pump pan bolts. These are 6mm bolts. That's a 10mm head. On Japanese cars, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, the bolt size is, on smaller bolts, is 4mm smaller than the head size. For example, a 10mm head bolt is going to be a 6mm bolt size or stud size. 12mm will be an 8mm stud size, and so on. The larger bolts get, the more that changes. They'll go up to 5mm. For example, a bolt with a 15mm head is going to have a 10mm stud size. 12mm stud size will be a 17mm head size, and so on. It's not always that way, but it's sort of a general rule. We've got these bolts out of here. Now these oil pans are glued on with RTV silicone, so you do have to coerce them off. And that means running a screwdriver between the flange of the oil pan and the engine block itself. Just be gentle, take your time. You're going to bend up that oil pan flange a little bit. It's no big deal. It's easy to straighten. It helps if you get the screwdriver between the block and the oil pan. Okay, it's off of there. Now we've got the entire bottom end exposed. We're going to check that oil pan out. Give us some indication of what the main and rod bearings look like by how much metallic crap there is in the bottom of that pan. And it looks really clean. This thing does have a magnetic oil drain plug, and doesn't look like there's any fur growing off of it, which indicates quite a bit of metal flake on that magnet. We're going to take the oil pump pickup tube off. The oil pump is mounted on the front of the engine, and it's driven by a shoulder that's ground into the nose of the crankshaft. It's got two pump bolts there that are 12mm head that hold it to the oil pump itself. Taking a little vape here. And it's got two more 10mm headed bolts that run through the side of that main girdle that are kind of braces as it runs down the length of that stud girdle to the back of the oil pan. And they're easy to get to. Simple enough. Now you gotta watch the bottom of the oil pans on these Nissan engines. If they get bent up, running over something, or for whatever reason, if the bottom of that oil pump gets bent up, it can seal the bottom of that oil pump pickup and you'll lose oil pressure. So if you've got low oil pressure in one of these engines, a good place to start is to check to see if the bottom of the oil pan sump is bent upwards and not flat across the bottom. Okay, we're going to put a 27mm socket on the end of that bolt we screwed into the end of the crankshaft so we can rotate it around, get the rod bolts out, all these rod and piston assemblies pulled. Just takes a normal 3/8 drive ratchet to get these things off of there. They're about 40-45 foot-pounds torque. They're not terrible. Take the nuts off and put them somewhere. Now we're not going to use these rod bolts when we put this thing back together. I don't use rod bolts over again. If an engine has any miles at all on it, I always replace the rod bolts, and we normally go back with just ARP bolts. Okay, I'm going to use my trusty old piece of hickory. Just tap on the rod bolts, get that rod to move down a little bit into the cylinder, or up into the cylinder bore I should say, and that cap will slide off. Just look at the rod caps. Some of the bearings, when you're taking apart an engine that has miles on it, they sometimes like to stick to the crankshaft surface, so you'll get the cap off, but the bearing shell will still be stuck to the crankshaft. That doesn't necessarily indicate something bad. It just happens. Sometimes it can be very bad if there's a spun bearing or something like that, but it doesn't mean there's a problem just because a bearing shell sticks to the crank. Now you've just got to find somewhere to get some leverage against that connecting rod to push it down so that you can get the piston rings to pop out. One important note on this is before you start this procedure, you need to inspect your cylinders to make sure that if there is a cylinder ridge on the tops of each of the cylinders, something that you can catch a fingernail on when you run your fingernail up the cylinder wall. If it's very deep at all, you need to cut that ridge before you try pulling the pistons out. Otherwise, the rings will bind on that ridge while you're trying to drive the piston out of the cylinders, and you'll end up breaking rings. It makes it a lot tougher. You can rent a ridge cutting tool at most decent sized part stores, O'Reilly's, Pep Boys, stuff like that, AutoZone, things like that. They generally have them for rent. They're easy to use. They don't take long to cut cylinder ridges down. Always put the rod caps back on the rod that it came off of, and always put them on the correct way with the cylinder number that's stamped on the side of the rod, of the cap and the rod on the same side of that rod. Does that make any sense? The rods are stamped with a number for the cylinder that they come out of. That one was cylinder number 1, so it would be stamped with a 1. And it stamped on the rod cap and on the rod itself. And those numbers need to be on the same side. Putting things back together that way just makes them easier to find later when you go back to assemble them, take them to the machine shop or whatever. Same thing. Just tap those rod bolts a little bit. Get some distance between the cap and the rod itself. And then wiggle the cap around, it'll slide right off. And that one did leave the bearing shell stuck to the crank, so just push the rod down a little bit with your fingers, and that bearing shell will come right off, unless it's stuck to the crank. Then you've got real problems. Just find the best angle of attack to try to push that piston out of the cylinder. Remember, the rod is a mounted pivot on that piston, so the rod's going to try to move around. If you just try to use it to push with, it's going to try to move back and forth. So you just got to kind of find the right place and put a little constant pressure, and it should come right out. This engine, as we saw earlier, doesn't have any cylinder ridge. It had a little bit of carbon built up. I took a little bit of, I think it was 600 grit sandpaper, and just lightly went over the carbon with some 600 grit sandpaper, knock off the big stuff, and then went over it with a solvent rag, and it came right off. Now, I hate to further bad habits, so the first two you saw me do, I did in kind of a sloppy way. This time I'm going to pull this rod cap off and show you the way you should be doing it, and that's just to put some fuel hose or anything that fits on those rod bolts over them while you're driving them out, just to protect the crankshaft. The block and the crank and heads and everything else are going to go over to the machine shop anyway, but it's just good habit to get into to protect everything while you're tearing it down. Now I've got that cap off. Now I'm going to put two pieces, just short pieces of fuel line, 5/16 fuel line, on the ends of those rod bolts, just so they don't scrape against the crank while you're trying to drive that rod assembly out of the cylinder. Actually, if you're just careful and push the rod bolts with your thumbs or something like that to get them clear of the crankshaft, you'll be in pretty good shape. But this is a safe, easy, and fast way to ensure that you don't hurt your crankshaft. Okay, we skipped some of the cylinders in this sequence just to save some time. They all come out the same way. That number 2 cylinder that you saw me do earlier had some pretty nasty damage to the piston skirt. I'll show you a close-up of it later. Now we're going to go ahead and pull this crank girdle off of here. Break all the bolts loose. Keep the engine stand from running around too much. Again, you can use air tools if you have them to do this part of the work. It's not going to hurt anything. Just be careful anytime you're using air tools. After they're broken loose, I go back with a air ratchet, and run the bolts all the way out. Simple enough. The stud girdle, remember, is sort of an interference fit inside the block. The block is machined so that this girdle actually fits up inside slightly, about probably 65 thousandths into the block. It's an interference fit, so you'll have to tap it. You don't have to beat on it. Just take a dead blow hammer or a rubber mallet, something like that. Don't use a steel hammer, and just tap it on both sides, back and forth, until it comes out. Now our crank is exposed. We can see our mains, see what kind of shape the crank journals are actually in. And they are looking very nice right now. The only thing keeping us from pulling the crank out right now is the oil pump. So we're going to go ahead and pull the bolts out of the oil pump. It's just bolted to the front of the block. and they're using, for the most part, they're a 10 millimeter head bolt, 6 millimeter stud size. There's also some 12 millimeters that go through it that hold various accessories on, and since they're off right now, we don't have to worry about them. We're also going to pull this idler pulley off to get it the hell out of the way. Okay, all the bolts are out. Now we're going to try to coax this crankshaft drive gear off of here. It's the actually the pulley for the timing belt drive that goes onto the crankshaft. And sometimes they can be a real pain in the butt on these engines, or on any engine for that matter. I was originally going to make this the last part of this teardown series, because there's not a hell of a lot left to tear down. But since I ran into problems with this drive gear on the crankshaft, I decided to make it one of those teachable moments. So I'll be doing a fourth part to this video to show how to remove a stuck drive gear. And that'll be in a few days. Okay, that's it for this video. I will be back here in a few days once I get the rest of this spliced together and narrated. And until then, have fun, drive safe, and I'll see you guys later.